The marble pillar was the only thing keeping Delaney Harwood upright, and Kent Duvall knew it. His fingers were clamped around her wrist with the kind of pressure that leaves evidence, deep, thumb-shaped bruising that takes 2 weeks to yellow and fade. Around them, the Ontario Design Excellence Gala carried on in full, glittering ignorance. The chandeliers in the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York were throwing light-off champagne flutes and silk lapels, and nobody from the main floor was looking at the east corridor, where a man was quietly threatening a woman against a wall. Nobody except the man at the far end of the hallway, who had stopped walking, who had set down his drink, who was now beginning, with slow and terrible patience, to undo his cuffs. 3 hours earlier, Delaney had stood in front of the floor-length mirror in her hotel room on the 14th floor and told herself she could do this. She was 30 years old, a senior design lead at Hart & Associates, and tonight the Ontario Design Council was presenting the Meridian Prize, the most prestigious honor in Canadian urban planning, to the Lakeshore Transit Village project, a project she had poured 3 years of her life into, developed inside her relationship with Kent Duvall, on her laptop, in her notebooks, in her head at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, because the corridor alignments weren't right, because the green space ratios were off, because she knew there was a more elegant solution and was going to find it or die trying. A project that was now legally credited to the Duvall Urban Group. Her name was not on the plaque. Her name was not in the program. Kent had ensured that 18 months ago, shortly before she packed a single suitcase and left his Distillery District apartment at 4 in the morning without a note, because leaving a note meant he could respond to it, and she was done being responded to. Tonight was not about reclaiming credit. Tonight was about surviving the room. She pulled her shoulders back and looked at herself honestly in the glass. She was a plus-size woman, a fact that Kent had spent 2 years treating as a problem to be managed. Tonight she wore a deep burgundy crepe gown that fell to the floor in clean, uninterrupted lines, the structured bodice doing exactly what well-cut fabric was supposed to do, supporting her without apologizing for her. Her dark hair was pinned up in a simplicity that had taken 40 minutes to achieve. She had done her eyes smoky and her lips bare. She looked, by any fair assessment, remarkable. She also looked like a woman steeling herself for something she hadn't fully agreed to yet. Her phone buzzed. Her colleague Bex, a junior planner who'd been tracking the evening's program, sent a single message. "Kent is confirmed on stage. He's accepting. I'm sorry, D." Delaney set her phone face down on the vanity. Then she picked up her evening bag and walked out the door. The ballroom was everything the Fairmont Royal York promised. Soaring ceilings, pre-war plasterwork, the particular hush of a room where everyone present was either spending or managing significant money. Architects, urban planners, developers, and the quietly wealthy patrons who underwrote all of it had filled the space with bright conversation and practiced smiles. Delaney moved through the room with the measured confidence of someone who knew which conversations to have and which to exit cleanly. She did not look at the stage. She accepted a glass of sparkling water at the bar and let herself be absorbed into a conversation with 2 planners from Vancouver discussing affordable housing intensification along rapid transit corridors. This was Delaney's area of genuine, deep knowledge. She relaxed fractionally. This was ground she knew. At the far side of the room, in an alcove framed by 2 stone columns, a man stood alone with a glass of tonic and lime. He did not appear to be at the event so much as observing it from a slight remove, the way a naturalist might observe something in its habitat. Tall, broad through the shoulders, perhaps 40 or so, dressed in a charcoal suit that had been made for him specifically and worn by someone who had long since stopped thinking about expense. Dark hair touched with grey at the temples, a face that was angular and unhurried. He was looking at Delaney. He had been looking at Delaney for most of the last hour, not with the appraisal she'd grown accustomed to deflecting, That slow, surgical inventory that men like Kent deployed, searching for flaws to itemize later. This was something more considered. The way someone looks at a building they've been trying to understand for a long time, and have finally, quietly, begun to. His name was Niall Carver. If you worked in Canadian real estate or urban development, you knew the Carver name without needing an introduction. His family's firm had shaped the skylines of Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary across 4 decades. Niall himself had taken the company into something quieter and more absolute in recent years. He didn't build for visibility. He built for permanence. He sat on boards and zoning tribunals and advisory panels without making news about it. He was the call that got made before the official calls, the name that ended arguments in rooms where arguments cost money. He knew Delaney's published research, had read it carefully, had quietly inquired about her through a contact at Hart 6 months ago, and had spent that time looking for a reasonable occasion to introduce himself. He had not planned for Kent Duvall to be the reason. The smell reached Delaney before she heard his voice. Aqua di Parma and Scotch, a combination her nervous system had been conditioned to fear. Her spine went rigid before she'd consciously registered it, the water glass nearly slipping from her fingers. Delaney, low, smooth, pitched for her ears only. You look well, all things considered. She turned slowly. Kent stood 3 feet away, immaculate in a steel blue tuxedo, his expression arranged into the particular warmth of a man who had practiced charm, for so long it had become indistinguishable from personality. He was not entirely sober. She could tell by the way his eyes moved over her. That deliberate, surgical inventory, lingering in the places he knew still hurt. Kent. She kept her voice level. I didn't know you'd be attending. I'm the recipient of the Meridian Prize, sweetheart. Where else would I be? His gaze traveled over the burgundy gown, with a precision that made it feel like a scalpel. That color is very brave on you, very statement-making. The words landed exactly where he intended them, as a compliment with a razor folded inside. Excuse me, she said and turned away. His hand closed around her upper arm before she'd taken a full step. Not grabbing, not yet, just settling there, a question mark with teeth. But the pressure was articulate. It said, "You're not going anywhere I don't allow." He guided her. It couldn't be called forcing, not on a main floor full of her professional peers. Toward the east corridor, past the service doors, into the quieter stretch of hallway where the chandeliers gave way to wall sconces, and the noise of the ballroom became a muffled hum. Delaney let herself be moved because she understood the alternative with terrible clarity. Making a scene in a room full of colleagues. She'd spent 2 years learning that making noise only ever hurt her. That emotional, volatile, difficult were labels that stuck, and once they stuck, nothing else did. In the corridor, alone, the pretense dissolved. Kent's grip shifted to her wrist, pressing hard against the inner bones, and he walked her backward until her shoulders found the marble pillar. You being here tonight is an embarrassment, he said, his voice very flat and very quiet. The whole room knows who you are, the jilted ex-girlfriend who can't let go of work she consulted on. It's pathetic, Delaney, it genuinely is. I didn't consult on it. Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. I designed it, every square meter, and you know that. What I know is that you signed an NDA when you left my apartment. He leaned slightly closer, the Scotch sharpening. What I know is that I have a legal team that can make your career disappear so completely you'd be lucky to get a job reviewing permit applications in a suburb that doesn't have a Tim Hortons. The smile again, the charity function smile. So you're going to finish your water, and you're going to leave before the awards program begins. Quietly, professionally, and we're never going to have this conversation again. Delaney opened her mouth. The sound that came was not hers. Take your hand off her wrist. The voice was calm, completely, almost unsettlingly calm. It carried the authority of a man who had issued far more consequential directives in far smaller rooms, and it landed in the corridor like something dropped from a height. solid, and impossible to pretend hadn't happened. Niall Carver stood at the far end of the hallway. He walked forward at the same unhurried pace he brought to everything, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression entirely neutral. And that neutrality was the most frightening thing about him. He had the face of someone performing no calculation whatsoever, because there was nothing in this situation he considered uncertain. Kent turned, his grip on Delaney's wrist loosening by the smallest fraction. "This is private. Back off." Niall did not stop walking. He reached the midpoint of the corridor and paused, not because anything had halted him, but because he had chosen to. He looked at Delaney first. Not at Kent. At Delaney, with a directness that required some acclimatizing to, dark grey eyes, level, that took in the whiteness around her mouth and the way she was holding herself very still. Something moved briefly across his face before it was controlled and set aside. "Are you all right?" he asked her. It was addressed only to her. She shook her head. Neil returned his attention to Kent. Then, without theatrics, without any change in his expression, he reached for his left cuff. He undid the cufflink, a small, square thing in matte platinum, and set it in his breast pocket. He moved to the right, the same process, the same deliberate quiet. He tucked the second cufflink away. Then he rolled his left sleeve back to the elbow, and then his right. His forearms were tattooed, old ink, dark lines that had blurred and softened with time, the way old commitments do when they've been kept long enough to become part of the skin. In zoning tribunal rooms, in the private offices where the real city got built, people knew what it meant when Niall Carver removed his cufflinks. It meant the formal portion of the evening was over. Kent Duvall had never been in those rooms. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Niall Carver, Carver Holdings." He said it the way you'd give someone a street address, informative, final. He stepped closer to Kent with an economy of movement that conveyed enormous physical confidence, the kind that doesn't need demonstration. "I sit on the Provincial Design Review panel. I'm also the primary financier of the Toronto Waterfront Redevelopment Authority, which currently holds the permits for your firm's next 3 projects." He tilted his head very slightly. "Let go of her wrist." Kent let go. Delaney pulled her arm back, her fingers wrapping instinctively around the bruised place. The cold of the corridor felt different now, less like a trap and more like air. "This isn't your business," Kent said. The hairline fracture in his confidence was widening. "She is Delaney Harwood," Neil said. "Someone whose work I have followed for some time, and someone I have been looking forward to meeting. She is not your anything." He paused. "And if I learn that she has any additional bruises after tonight, I will ensure the next several years of your professional life become a very quiet, very thorough administrative problem. We understand each other." Kent looked at him for a long moment, running a calculation. Then something in his posture settled, not contrition, but the specific resignation of a man who has correctly identified that the room has changed. He straightened his jacket. He walked back toward the ballroom without another word. Niall waited until Kent's footsteps had fully receded. Then he turned to Delaney, and in the same moment the quality of his presence shifted, not softened exactly, but directed differently, the way a room changes when a window opens. "Can I look at your wrist?" She extended it without quite deciding to. He held it with care, his hands warm, tilting it toward the sconce light to examine the reddening marks around the bones. "There's going to be bruising," he said. "I know. My car is downstairs. There's a first aid kit." She almost laughed. "Of course there is. And I have been wanting to talk to you about your Eglinton corridor research for the better part of 6 months, he said, still examining the marks. "If you're at any point interested in a conversation that isn't this one." Delaney looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She had learned to read people with uncomfortable accuracy after 2 years of living with Kent. What she found in Niall Carver's face was disarming in its clarity. A man who meant exactly what he said, no more and no less, who would consider it wasteful to perform anything he didn't feel. He guided her out through the service exit, past the back of the kitchen, into the private garage, where a dark Escalade was waiting. His driver, a broad, quiet man named Dex, who clearly functioned in several capacities, looked once at her wrist and produced a cold compress from a console compartment without being asked. They were 20 minutes north of the hotel, in the private elevator of a Yorkville building with no lobby directory, when Niall's phone rang. He answered it. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened by a degree. "Send it to the tablet," he said, and ended the call. He turned to Delaney with the directness she was already beginning to recognize. "Kent has called a press conference for Monday morning, 8 o'clock, Duvall Urban Group offices." Delaney went very still. "He's filed a complaint with the Ontario Professional Planners Institute. He's alleging that you falsified credentials and plagiarized proprietary research from his firm during your relationship, that the Lakeshore Transit Village concept was taken from internal Duvall documents." Neil watched her face. "He wants you discredited before the week is out." She sat with this for a moment. The elevator opened into a wide, spare penthouse, floor-to-ceiling glass, the city grid below lit against the October dark, Lake Ontario in the distance, a flat surface holding the reflection of everything. "He's projecting," she said. Niall said nothing. He waited. She stood. She needed to move and crossed to the window. "When I still lived with him, he got drunk one night and left his billing records open on his laptop, not his firm's records. A personal ledger. He's been running phantom consultant invoices through 3 separate municipal contracts. City of Toronto, the Waterfront Authority, and a regional municipality of York project." She turned around. "He bills for consultants who don't exist. The money runs through a numbered company in Bermuda. He called it his margin correction. He thought it was clever." She paused. "He always thought he was the smartest person in the room." The silence in the penthouse had a different texture now. Niall stood very still, his sleeves still rolled to the elbow. "Do you remember the company name?" he asked. "Clearpath Municipal Consulting. The Bermuda registration number was BM7744 Duvall." She said it evenly. "He kept the number because he found it amusing to be that obvious and still untouchable." Dex, standing at the edge of the room, made a quiet sound and showed Niall the screen of his tablet. Niall looked at it. A slow, particular expression moved across his face, more measured than satisfaction and more durable. "She's right," he said. "There's more. 5 contracts. The total is closer to 63 million over 4 years. He set the tablet down. "The Waterfront Authority conducts its own financial audits. I have standing access to their preliminary findings." He looked at Delaney. "He is not a careful man." "No," she agreed. "He always assumed the room would protect him." Niall picked up his cufflinks from the kitchen counter where he'd set them and held them without putting them back on. "He has a press conference Monday morning," he said. "So do you." Monday arrived grey and cold, the particular flat overcast of a Toronto autumn that makes the city look like a blueprint of itself. The Duvall Urban Group occupied a glass and concrete building on King Street West, and by 8 o'clock its lobby held journalists, city planning reporters, architecture media, and 2 representatives from the OPPI who were working hard to maintain neutral expressions. Kent stood at the front of the room in a fresh suit. He had rebuilt himself overnight into something that read as reasonable and wronged. He had brought lawyers. He had brought a binder. He had, Delaney noted from the lobby doorway, also brought the particular energy of a man who believes sufficient confidence substitutes for truth. She walked in halfway through his opening remarks. The burgundy gown was in a hotel dry cleaning bag. Today she wore a charcoal blazer over a cream shirt, tailored trousers, leather boots that made no noise on the floor. She wasn't interested in a dramatic entrance. She was interested in being heard. Her dark hair was loose. She carried a single USB drive between 2 fingers. The room noticed her. Kent's voice faltered, caught, recovered. "I want to be clear," he was saying, "that this is not personal." "It is entirely personal," Delaney said, and every head in the room turned. She walked to the front table without hurrying, the unhurried pace of someone who has spent years doing the actual work and is no longer interested in performing uncertainty about it. She set the drive on the table in front of the nearest OPPI representative. That drive contains time-stamped source files for every design element of the Lakeshore Transit Village project, she said, her voice clear and carrying. The metadata shows creation dates, modification histories, and author credentials. All of it predates any document the Duvall Urban Group produced internally. Your firm's earliest internal file on the project is dated 11 months after my first sketches. She looked at Kent. "I can show you the comparison if you'd like." "Those files could be fabricated," Kent said. His voice had developed a new quality. "Something thinner. They can be independently verified by the OPPI review panel, the Law Society, or any of the 3 forensic data analysts whose contact information is also on that drive." She paused. "I'd recommend the third option." The lobby doors opened at the back of the room. Neil Carver walked in the way he walked everywhere, without announcing himself, because rooms went quiet anyway. Beside him were 2 people Delaney hadn't met. A woman wearing a Financial Forensic Services lanyard, and a man in the navy jacket of the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. Kent's color changed in a way that had nothing to do with lighting. "The Toronto Waterfront Redevelopment Authority completed a preliminary audit this morning," Neil said from where he stood near the doors. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, and the room chose to hear him. "Clearpath Municipal Consulting. $63 million in fraudulent invoices across 5 municipal contracts over 4 years. BM7744 Duvall." He let that settle. "The initials were yours, Mr. Duvall." That was apparently a creative choice. The RCMP officer stepped forward. "Kent Allen Duvall, you're being detained for questioning under the Proceeds of Crime Act. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay." The room broke apart into noise. Journalists moved. Cameras swung. Kent turned to Delaney. She had seen this expression on him once before, the night she left, when she reached the door with her suitcase, and he finally understood she wasn't going to be called back. It was not remorse. It was the face of a man encountering a reality he had failed to adequately model. "You did this," he said. "You and Carver, you planned this." "No," Delaney said. There was no heat in her voice, and no satisfaction either, just something quieter than both. Something that had been waiting a long time to have room to stand in. "You planned this 3 years ago, when you left your laptop open and laughed at your own cleverness. I just remembered." She turned and walked through the noise, through the cameras and the controlled disintegration happening at the front of the room, through the glass lobby doors and out into the grey October air of King Street. Niall came out a moment later. He stood beside her on the sidewalk. The city moved around them, a streetcar grinding through the intersection, cyclists, the ordinary indifferent machinery of a Monday morning. He didn't offer commentary or manage her reaction. He simply stood there, which was, she was coming to understand, one of his more significant qualities. "Thank you," she said, "for the Waterfront Authority access. Thank you for the Bermuda registration number." A brief pause. "I'd been looking for that shell company for 8 months." She glanced at him sidelong. "And the other part, the 6 months, the research." "Also true." He said it without inflection. "I don't tend to say things I don't mean. It's a habit I formed early and find useful." The streetcar ground past. A gust of lake wind moved leaves along the pavement. "I designed the best thing I've ever made," Delaney said. Not to him exactly, but not to herself either. And someone took it and stood in a ballroom and accepted an award for it, and I spent 18 months convincing myself that was just the shape of how things go. For someone like me. Niall didn't respond because it wasn't a question. He was listening. That was different from responding. "It isn't," she said, "the shape of how things go." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She exhaled slowly. The city noise filled in around them, practical and enormous and entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had just finished happening inside that building. "You mentioned a conversation," she said, "about the Eglinton corridor." "I did. I have positions on the northern extension that I've never published. They're fairly aggressive. I would expect nothing less from you." The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, but it moved. "Are you free this morning?" Delaney picked up her bag. She looked once at the glass doors of the Duvall building, the lobby still churning, something that had held weight over her for 2 years in the process of dismantling itself by its own architecture. She felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely track the specific and unhurried sensation of having nowhere to be except exactly where she chose. "Yes," she said, "I am." They walked north together into the grey October morning, and the city went on being exactly what it was. Vast, indifferent, and full of things built by people whose names had not yet been credited, waiting to be. Delaney Harwood had spent 2 years making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's story. It turned out that was never going to be possible, not really. She was always going to be exactly this much, take up exactly this much space, know exactly this much. The only thing that had changed was that now she had stopped apologizing for it. And that, more than any prize, more than any boardroom, was the thing no one was ever going to take from her again. If Delaney's story hit somewhere real for you, if you've ever watched someone claim credit for what you built and wondered if the truth had any teeth left, drop a comment and tell us, what would you have done in that corridor? Would you have walked away, or would you have stayed and fought? Subscribe to Blind Curves for more stories about women who remember exactly who they are, just in time. Like and share this one with someone who might need to hear it today.